Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. The development and leveraging of technology surely must be one of the most defining elements of the 21st century. I mean, the amount of data we're able to collect on life and living is nearly infinite. We as humans living in this time and space are fortunate to have so many tools at our disposal, insofar as gathering data and information, in order to make informed decisions. That being said, effectively communicating and presenting what we uncover as far as key findings is still the more critical element in this equation of ultimately affecting change for any particular cause. And take highly charged constructs like politics, law, or even environmental issues, such as the conservation of particular species. Oftentimes, intense feelings, traditions, and just flat out stubbornness stand in the way of breakthroughs. Well, our guest today is someone who deals with such challenge on a daily basis as an individual immersed in the world of science, discovery, and the fight for change relating to a cause she deeply cares for. All right, welcome to the show. So, Mareike Dornhege is the Chief Science Officer and founder of Ocean Eye, a platform that provides incentives from ecotourism to local communities to prevent poaching. She's also a scientific advisor to Churamura, an Okinawan marine conservation NGO. Holding a master's degree from the University of Oxford and a PhD from Sophia University in Tokyo, her expertise is in marine ecology with a focus on shark ecology. Mareike has worked extensively with Japanese fishermen across the country on collecting data on the impact of fisheries on shark populations and establishing guidelines for sustainable fisheries. Her knowledge has gained her invitations to many global conferences as one of the leading experts on the status of sharks in Japan. And she's even published her research in various scientific journals, including Nature, and her public outreach ranges from podcasts much like this to documentaries and hosting for the Discovery Channel's Shark Week. And here's a sampling of but a few more things she's sunk herself into. Creating the first global financial payments mechanism for wildlife conservation, which at its core targets the problems of unsustainable fishing and poaching. Japan country leader for the Global Fin Print Project, the largest global scale assessment of shark and ray biodiversity on coral reefs to date. Bridge the gap between the different stakeholders ranging from fishermen, fishery managers, and processors on Japan's largest shark fishery, achieving more sustainable management and policy. And finally, Japan Country Coordinator for Women for Oceans, an international marine conservation NGO. So with all that stated, Mareike, it's an honor to have you on the program. Welcome. How are you doing?
No, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be able to talk to you.
Yeah. I mean, we've been going back and forth for a little while, trying to line things up here. And yeah, right from the get-go, I was intrigued by just all that you do. And I think it's so unique, I think, within this market here within Japan to have somebody who's such highly specialized in one specific area that yeah, I'm really keen, just as a waterman myself out on the ocean quite a bit to hear a little bit more of what you've got to say about it all. So yeah, again, thanks for taking some time. In terms of, I guess, getting things going, I do have the first segment lined up. And as my guests know, it's something called Coloring Wikipedia. And I just basically read off a definition of the guest profession. I do it for a couple of reasons. One, it brings everybody up to speed on what that job entails or what the industry is all about. And then two, it's just this nice launching pad into a discussion. Sometimes we as professionals, we own our position and it might be a little bit different, like what you do versus somebody who holds the same position in a different country, different company, or elsewhere. So again, it's just kind of a nice point to get things kicked off. So I do have you down for a chief science officer. I understand we could have went with an entrepreneur, but I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later on. So let me just read that off, a chief science officer, and just consider all that you've done, and maybe you can comment after. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, here we go. Chief Science Officer. A Chief Scientific Officer, a CSO, is a position at the head of scientific research operations at organizations or companies performing significant scientific research projects. A CSO is typically responsible for envisioning and developing research capabilities, human and technological, for developing evidence of the validity and utility of research products, and for communicating with the scientific and customer communities concerning capabilities and scientific product offerings. A complete mouthful, but maybe you can put this into plain English for people, because I think people outside of this world that you live within, a lot of that is just probably flying right over their heads. So maybe you can kind of break that down. Maybe that's the first point we can
It's
kind of.
it's really funny because actually this is the first time I've ever heard the official definition
Okay.
of a chief science officer,
How'd Wikipedia
and
fare?
we never really thought much about it.
Yeah.
So to clarify, the founder of Ocean Eye is my business partner, and I'm a co-founder. I'm a co-founding
Yeah.
member, and she's really the one. She's the one who owns it. She's on the business side, but of course, like as you've detailed, in Ocean Eye, we work with the ocean. We work with natural resources, and everything needs to have a scientific foundation.
Hmm.
Otherwise, we're just not doing good work. And that's exactly what the chief science officer does. So the
Yeah.
chief science officer makes sure the science behind everything is correct.
It's legit.
And that's, of
Yeah.
course, why you will often find people with PhDs in the respective subject in
Yeah.
those positions. And then,
Okay.
for example, for me, so for Ocean Eye, we would look at certain target species. We're like, okay, these are our flagship species, or these are
Mm,
the target species we want to collect data on, we want to monitor on. And it's me who determines which species we're looking at for different reasons. It could be because they're highly fished, it could be they're ecologically very valuable as a reason. So I'm the one who does that and collects all the data, who checks the data, who looks at the
mm,
literature, and it makes sure we select the right species to work with. And then in my other function at Churamura, which is mainly focused on turtle conservation, but also general marine conservation in Okinawa, Japan, as a scientific advisor, I do the same thing. So
okay.
again, they're trying to collect data. So for example, they're trying to collect data on turtle nests and baby turtles hatching. And so when they started, someone was there with a clipboard, and they're like, "Okay, let me write something down about these turtles hatching." And then
Yeah.
they were like, "What exactly should we be writing down?" And I
Mm.
was like, "Okay, I will tell you. I will tell you what you should be writing down."
Right.
So
Right.
that's basically the job of the chief science officer, or also scientific advisor.
Okay. Yeah, I think that brings it down to a level where, the rest of us can kind of keep up with you on that point. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. In terms of, I guess you already mentioned it a couple times, and I referenced it off the top here, Ocean Eye, this company that you just mentioned you co-founded. This platform is very unique, and it kind of caught my eye when I dug into it in terms of, the incentives that it provides within ecotourism to local communities to prevent poaching. And it is quite compelling. And maybe this one might be a nice opportunity to learn a little bit more in detail. Like, how does that system work? Like, what are the levers that allows for this to,
I
have
Let me
significant,
try to give you
impact?
kind of the 60-second summary.
Yeah.
I think many of us are familiar that we have a problem with poaching in the ocean. There's shark finning, people collecting
Yeah.
turtle eggs, and very often this happens in third world countries. And we also know why. It's people looking for a livelihood, and often they don't have an
Hmm.
alternative. And so they're not doing this because they're evil. It's just something that's there where they're trying to make a living. And in the past, often NGOs, governments, they've recognized the problem, and they try to combat this by saying like, hey, you fishing community, fishing village, we will give you donations, money from a government program or an NGO, so you please don't collect the turtle eggs anymore,
Yeah.
you don't fin the sharks anymore. And in the end, if we look, I mean, humans are opportunistic. The donations come and go, so they're like, okay, nice, I will take the donation, and then when no one
Hmm.
is looking I mean, there's a shark right there, so I might as well also fin it on top. There's no
Yeah.
controls. So with Ocean Eye, we wanted to tie the two together because for those communities, a turtle egg collected and the shark fin harvested is still the most valuable thing for them.
Mm-hmm.
And what they don't really had access to is making money from these animals through tourism.
Yeah.
So they're not the ones who run the dive shops or the hotels who are like, hey, come stay in my hotel, snorkel on our house reef because we have sharks and turtles. They do not benefit from that. It's usually foreign investors, foreign run hotels and operations. And we're like, so what we did is, and these operations also have a really keen interest in stopping poaching. Because for them, sharks are a lot more versatile than that. So we said like, hey, why don't you log all your sightings with the tourists in an app? And when the tourists see them after the dive, you log it. And for every shark they see, for every turtle they see, you make a tiny donation to the village. So if you don't see anything, no donation. If you see a lot, it's a few dollars.
Okay.
And that's how we tied the two together. And of course, for the tourists, it also becomes really interesting because once the system is more established, they can check in the app, like, oh, where are the places to see the marine life you own, to see like mantas, turtles, sharks, and so on.
Ah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Was that something that, we might get into this later, but I'll ask right now. Was that something that sort of slowly developed that idea itself, or was it something that sort of like hit you one day where it's like, no, like this could work, or was it?
It was the founder who
Okay.
came up with the idea, and we met at a hackathon.
All right.
And I was a presenting scientist at a marine conference in Borneo, and she was there not as a scientist, but she has a background in Greenpeace for like many, many years as a campaigner. And we got together for the hackathon, kind of hashed out the idea more in the 3 days it ran. Well, I was also presenting my research on the side, and then we made it into the finals because there were more people there, experts who said like, it sounds like this idea has legs. So that's how we got our starting ground.
Yeah.
And since then, we've been working on it.
Yeah. Not a shabby few days for you there. It sounds like some good presentations and coming up with this whole business model essentially that it can really make, positive impact. Okay. Well, thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that. Yeah. In terms of, I guess, like a typical day for you, I know when we were trying to arrange this call, you were off to visit an island off the coast of Japan and speaking with representatives from a local fishery there. Like, what would be a typical day or even a typical week for you in your role as a CSO?
Okay, I think when it comes to like marine biologists and marine ecologists, I think we've all seen the meme, like what society thinks I do, what my parents think I do, and what I
Right.
actually do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think what society and my parents think I do is like I'm diving with sharks every day.
Every day. Right. Yeah.
And I wish that was true, but we also spend a lot of time in front of our computers. So we're really there, we're looking at data.
Yeah.
We're writing grant proposals because, of course, for research, also for NGO efforts, we're always looking for donations for grants to make these things reality. And then I have a new paper coming up as a co-author in Science magazine. It's a scientific journal, so the paper in Science. So for that as well means, again, we're sitting at the computer, we're looking at the paper we've written, we're making edits. So a lot of that is unfortunately also, we collect data in the field. And then things are very exciting. And then many other days we're answering emails, we're analyzing data, we're writing papers, we're writing research.
Okay.
And you mentioned the day, like you remember when I went to an island called Izena. So we did meet the managing director of the local fisheries cooperative. Very, very tiny island. I think like a few hundred people live on Izena.
Oh, wow.
So equally tiny is the fisheries cooperative. But we still wanted to talk to him at that time regarding turtles. So we also we deal a lot, or we're looking a lot into the turtle data for Okinawa because there's very little right now. And sadly, what happens with the turtles is, as you know, Japanese people like to eat seaweed.
Mm-hmm.
And they grow seaweed on farms. So they put big nets into
Yeah.
the shallow ocean, and the nets just give the seaweed something to cling on to. So big kind of
Yeah.
net grids. And who also likes to eat seaweed is green sea turtles.
Mm,
They often at night they will discover the nets in the shallows. Like when they come to the shallows to sleep, they see the nets and they're like, "Oh, food!" And they dive down head first. And when
mm-hmm.
unfortunately what happens is they get stuck
Yeah.
and then they drown. So we were like asking them like, how often do you find drowned turtles? And is there something you could change about the nets? So what we're doing there is we're trying to build relationships with
Yeah.
stakeholders and like finding out kind of preliminary data, like like how often are the drownings, what's causing the drownings, so that hopefully eventually we can find a solution to reduce that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think there's a question that's going to come up later on in the talk, but I can imagine that being like a highly charged topic from your perspective, but then also recognizing that if you're going in like guns a-blazing and like, why are you doing this? You need to make these changes now, now, now. Like, obviously, that's not going to work. You have to be a lot more diplomatic, I'm sure, and sensitive to some of their challenges and their issues. But yeah,
Yeah.
like I said, this is probably going to come up later on, but I'm eager to hear a little bit more about that soon. Before we get into that, though, I do want to shift over really quickly into a different segment. And it's a new segment, actually. It's called Pathways. And basically, it's kind of representative of this idea of how people's careers don't always follow these linear paths. I mean, sometimes they do, but oftentimes they don't. There's a lot of left-hand turns, zigging and zagging, so on and so forth. So, in terms of your backstory, I mean, how did you end up where you are right now? Maybe you could share with listeners a little bit more, in terms of, what led you into this profession.
Yeah. Um, I actually have 2 degrees or 2 specialties because I have 2 passions in life. And like one was always the ocean.
Hmm.
I grew up sailing a lot with my
Okay.
family. I'm half Dutch, half German, so grew up near the North Sea. And we went sailing a lot. So it was the first thing that like water was always part of my life. And I started scuba diving when I was 14.
Okay.
And I always loved sharks. Like my mom showed me, she was saying, as a kids were drawing like flowers and like stick figures, and she was like, you were drawing sharks when you were like 8.
Yeah, I had this question down. Like, this is definitely one of the ones I wanted to ask, so
Yeah.
I'm glad you're going to spill the beans here. So yeah.
So that was it was always there. And my first degree, my first bachelor's degree, was actually in communication because also I love writing, I love languages, I speak several languages.
Okay.
So I had a degree in communication, and then I started taking like my major is communication, minor in environmental management,
Hmm.
and my passion for the environment is, or especially the ocean, is always like the driving factor. But I think like if we look at kind of the Japanese the ikigai, my
Yeah.
skill was always communication and especially
Mm.
writing. So I had the 2 degrees, and for like a really really long time in my life, I also worked as a journalist, and
Okay.
I'm a chief science officer, but I also still work as a writer now. I work
Mm.
as a writer for a research team, and that's something I've always enjoyed is science communication.
Okay.
And like you said, degrees are not linear, and like often we like 2 things, and I think especially if we like 2 things, we have maybe a field of knowledge or passion that comes together with another skill becomes quite powerful.
Most definitely. I just had, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the podcast and radio program, Radio Lab, WNYC Studios, one of the most influential podcast programs in the last 20 years. And one of the co-hosts, I was lucky enough to have a conversation with him not too long ago. And he was speaking of that point exactly, of how for him, it was, his career sort of began with this passion for a few different areas and things, kind of much like what you're speaking about. But then as he progressed through, he began to like enter in some like logical thought and sort of like triangulating like what he could use his passion for, and then also some of his other skills and then education to position himself to do something unique and then land himself, in his present day profession that he has right now. And it was just kind of an interesting take, because I think a lot of people often assume that it's either A, you have this like vision from childhood and this is the line, I'm just going to go after it, or it's just all serendipity, I suppose, and it's not always A or B. There's a lot of in between, I think, in this. And it sounds like for you, at least, that could be the
And
case.
my line was very much like, and I was doing a master's degree in environmental management, and I was working as a journalist, and I came back
Yeah.
to marine ecology again in my PhD, and they were both there
Yeah.
always.
You mentioned already the languages, you had a passion for languages, but in terms of Japan and actually moving to Japan, going to university in Japan, what brought you here per se?
Curiosity.
Yeah, like all of
It
us, I
was
suppose,
not
right?
planned.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
not planned. I came to Japan in my mid-20s, so I'm sure I
okay,
really liked it. I came back for an extended period of time, and then I was introduced to my PhD advisor
okay.
through another environmental scientist, and she was like, "Oh, this professor is looking for a PhD student, and she works with the ocean, and she works with Japanese fishermen, and like maybe you should meet her."
Okay. All right, and the rest is history. All right. Well, yeah, yeah, I can certainly relate to that. I'm on the 1 year going on 20-year plan. So you're in Japan. So yeah, I can attest to all of that too.
Yeah.
There's some staying power to the country and the culture and everything else that it offers. Okay. Well, I would like to shift into another question here. And in terms of, I guess, getting back to what you're doing right now and, specific with, shark ecology. And, I'd reference this off the top where you often get called upon for these international conferences to go speak about the current state of, marine biology and ecology issues within Japan and specifically with sharks. Now, what are people wanting to find out from you, and what are you telling people about this issue within Japan?
They want data. So
Mm,
Japan really is a black box. And then
mm,
if you look at Japan, we have a couple of factors that make it really, really interesting. Number one, it's one of the biggest fishing nations in the world in
yeah.
terms of catch. Japan also has the 10th largest shark fishing in the world.
Mm,
And Japan has the highest shark biodiversity in the world. So in Japan, we
really?
found around just over 500 shark species. Around 120 are found in Japan because Japan is not a big country, but you live here, you know the
Yeah.
geography. We go from Hokkaido, which
Yeah.
is almost Arctic near Russia, all the way down to Okinawa, close to Taiwan and the Philippines is tropical. So we have so many different ecosystems, climate
Mm,
zones, that we have really high biodiversity of sharks, at the same time really, really large fishing effort. And then again, Japan is culturally is a black box. Like historically, Japan has often been closed off for long periods of time in history. They closed themselves off from the rest of the world, and part of it is still preserved in Japanese culture. They don't share as much. They don't
mm,
share the data, and also in the scientific community, like there's Japanese shark researchers, there's Japanese fisheries researchers. They sit on committees. They sit on committees for fisheries. Um, and tuna commissions and so on. But outside of that, they often only publish their research in Japanese, and then it's not accessible
yeah.
for the rest of the world. And then I was here, and I was often at very large global marine conferences, the only one there who came from Japan. And then
Mm,
everyone was very, very interested. They were like, "Hey, what's going on there?"
right.
And I could, to my surprise, I could amaze people with very simple data
Hmm.
I had access to here, like data I found in Japanese scientific journals or given by fisheries corporators or government reports, and just like simple translations of the data sets was already like, oh, okay, it's this species and it's that volume. And
Mm.
so just people just really didn't have the access or the knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, it makes all complete sense, when you explain it that way. But it's really interesting. I mean, what sort of struck me was that the biodiversity of the shark population in Japan, like again, geographically speaking, it makes complete sense the way you just sort of outlined it. But you'd have no idea. You'd have no idea
Yeah.
because you're right. Like even in like mainstream media, like it's not even really covered, and there isn't a lot. written about it. I mean, in terms of, I guess, ecology and those types of issues, Japan has infamously become, I don't know, associated with a few other things within that industry, or, well, what they're doing, with whaling, or with even that, that documentary, The Cove, and dolphins and different things. There's been a lot of, content that's been written up about those types of issues, but the shark population and whatnot, and biodiversity in that sense, really not a lot at all.
The folks over at Shark Week, they know very well. So if you look
Yeah,
at Shark Week, of course, it's mass media, sensationalist,
yeah,
but it's a few species of sharks everyone wants to see on Shark Week. Of course, everyone wants to see the great whites.
yeah.
People want to see tiger sharks. And then there's like another like more mysterious group of sharks that people really like is deep sea sharks. And
Hmm.
you find them here in Japan
Yeah.
because also we have kind of all the depths of oceans. And when I get called for Shark Week, it was like, can you get deep sea sharks on camera? That's what they
Right.
wanted because this is a hotspot.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. Really quick question, and this is a selfish one, but I live right on the inland sea here, and I think this is another point too. Like, Japan doesn't, again, mass media, and like shark attacks, and I know statistically speaking, they're very rare, and especially within Japan. But it kind of strikes me as odd in the sense that, like, there is this massive biodiversity of sharks, and yet, the reporting or the incidents with sharks and shark attacks themselves, pales in comparisons to countries, say, like Australia, or within America or elsewhere. Could you shed a little light on that, maybe, just really quickly?
So there's so as I mentioned before, there's over 500 shark species,
Yeah.
and the vast majority of them are not dangerous to
Right.
humans. So if
Right.
we have incidents, like we don't like to call them shark attacks, we like to call them incidents because that's what they really are.
Hmm.
It's usually the same handful of species. Like
Yeah.
sometimes it's great whites, bull sharks, oceanic whiteheads, great
Hmm.
hammerhead, tiger sharks, um, other types of requiem sharks. Requiem sharks are really like the sharky looking shark.
Okay.
Like lemon sharks, whale sharks, same category. Australia has a lot of whale sharks.
Mm.
So that might put them high on the list. Florida is also high on the list. They have lemon sharks, tiger sharks, bull sharks.
Mm.
There's bull sharks here, there's tiger sharks here. Both of them occur in Okinawa. Why do we have less incidents? People go a lot into the ocean. They dive, they surf. Sometimes it's geographical,
Mm.
but I think also a lot of the shark species we find in Japan, like what I just listed, as deep sea sharks. Human swimmers are not going to come into contact with deep sea sharks.
Yeah. Right.
It's just not happening. We're just
Yeah.
not in the same depths. Um, the whale sharks, like Okinawa is very famous for the whale sharks. Not dangerous.
Hmm.
They're
Yeah.
big filter feeders. They only eat plankton. A lot of the sharks, more like in the Tokyo area, is small coastal sharks, the dogfish, the cat sharks. These are like the little
Right.
ones.
Yeah.
So I think it's just, even though we have the bull sharks and the tiger sharks, the species you mentioned, it's just really so rare. And there might be something I would have to look into it. What is different about Australia and Florida from Japan? Because we have the same species.
Yeah.
Okinawa is also tropical. Maybe there's slightly more surfers. Surfing
Mm.
incidents are higher than diving incidents.
Yeah.
But still, it's like
Mm.
we're talking about Florida maybe has, I don't know, 10 incidents a year, and then Japan has two, so it's still
Right.
like a very
Yeah.
small
It's tough
difference.
to, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I thought I'd throw that in there anyway.
Mhm.
Yeah, getting back to the talk, I suppose, in terms of, getting in, well, to this point of Japan, and you brought it up already. I mean, their fishing culture, and the history behind that. And then also too, like the work that you're doing right now, and the evolution of science, and trying to understand, and the importance and significance put on ecology, especially marine ecology. You can see how there would be, some friction between these two different groups, or these two different types of, ideologies, essentially. And I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, like, how big of an issue that is in the work that you do. I would imagine it's always front and center, but to hear from somebody like yourself would be enlightening.
It's the biggest issue.
Yeah.
The biggest threat to sharks is overfishing.
Yeah.
Is the biggest threat. The next biggest threat is habitat loss, but that's tiny, pales in comparison to the fishing threat. And then people are, I think the general population is already well aware that shark finning is a thing that exists and that it's not good for sharks. And that's actually kind of only the tip of the iceberg, because if we look at shark finning, we're assuming someone is going out and targeting sharks and only taking their fins.
Yeah.
And luckily, that is rare and has become increasingly rare thanks to global policy and regulation. But what is still happening, and this really is the biggest threat, the biggest problem for sharks, is bycatch. So bycatch means we have a fishery that, for example, targets tuna or swordfish. But then how do we get these fish in the ocean?
Right.
We use, for example, long lines.
Mm-hmm.
Long lines are, it's one long line, as it says, up to 100 kilometers with thousands of hooks. Every couple of meters, we have a hook. We have like 100-kilometer line.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
And we cannot control what is going to bite each of these baited hooks. They're hoping for the tuna and the swordfish, but as you can imagine, it's going to attract a lot of sharks, turtles, birds. It's all sorts of marine life, and everything that we don't want is bycatch. Now, there are hundreds of lines, so we need to let out the line from the vessel. Letting it out alone, as you can imagine, takes a few hours. Then you let it soak for the fish to bite, and then you reel it back in. So all of this takes hours. Like, you can estimate, like, it depends who's doing it. There's regulations. Again, all the regulations are stricter because we want more of the bycatch to survive so we can release it. But like about after 12 hours or so, they bring back the line, and then they might have turtles on there. So you let the turtle go. You might have seabirds. They've made new measures to reduce the seabird catch rates. Let the seabirds go, and you also have sharks. But some of them, they've been struggling on that line for hours, and even if you let them go, they might not make it. And also sometimes, depending on the fishery and what the regulations they have, if, for example, it's a red hammerhead, oh, the red hammerhead is listed on CITES, I cannot take it. I have to let it go. As a shark species, blue shark, okay, it's not very valuable, but I will still take it. And this is the biggest issue for sharks, is they're being caught in other fisheries. Like, you've probably seen, you're in the supermarket, you're buying some tuna for your Niçoise salad, and you're like, oh, this can says it's dolphin friendly, I'm gonna buy that. It's probably dolphin friendly, but it's not very shark friendly.
Okay. Would you say it's the big fisheries, like the big companies, that are the massive problem, or would it be the collection of these tiny little towns and like small little fishing villages that are spread out all across Japan, as you know, like collectively, I'd imagine they would add up to something too. What would you say to that?
The bigger ones are a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones with the long lines. And they are also the ones that use what we call purse seine nets. A purse seine net is drawn by several boats.
Okay.
That make a big cycle that draw in a whole swarm of fish, often bonito.
Okay.
And in that massive net, you catch the whole ecosystem. And that's a really big guys. And then I did part of my research in smaller fishing villages. And that's just what they complain about, because they have, with the smaller vessels, they have, as you can imagine, smaller nets, shorter lines. They also use sometimes a method that is known as pole and line fishing. Pole and line fishing is, imagine a medium-sized vessel, a bunch of guys on deck, and they each have, their fishing was a pole and line, each of them. So they pull in bonito often, one by one. And if they see, oh, this is not a bonito, this is something else, they throw it back right away. So the less industrialized, the more we can discriminate We are catching it with
Mm,
less soak times. And this is an issue not only in Japan, because they also, as the bigger fisheries moved in on the high seas, they also saw their catches going down. We've seen this in other places as well, for example, Africa,
yeah.
where we have local fishermen with small nets they throw, pole and line, and then as big fisheries from other countries moved in offshore of their coast, they saw their catches going down.
Mm, okay. Okay. Well, that's insightful. I mean, not the most encouraging, but certainly insightful. Yeah. I do have another question. I'd like to move on to something else here. In researching for this talk, I came across a lot of inspiring, tidbits of information related to you and your work. And one thing that kind of caught my attention, which I found really interesting, was that back to Ocean Eye, the company itself launched a series of 10 NFT photographs in this collection called Ocean Eye Chasing the Beauty. And it was taken by this award-winning photojournalist and Ocean Eye associate, Paul Hilton. And the NFTs were minted on the Ethereum blockchain. And I'm just curious about what that approach was all about. I'm sure there's several different ways that you could raise awareness for what you're trying to do, but the choosing of, I guess, the blockchain and whatnot and NFTs, what was behind all that?
Okay, so Paul Hilton is one of our team members, and as a wildlife award-winning wildlife photographer, he just has amazing photography that
Hmm.
we have access to. Um, so basically, it was, first of all, it was right there, and then what Paul has done throughout his career is he not only captures the beauty of the ocean, but also the dark side. So the whole NFT collection has a dark and a light side. So we have the turtle on the coral reef in its natural habitat, and then we have the turtle that's been turned into a souvenir. And
Hmm.
same the shark. We have the shark, the blue shark swimming in the ocean, and then we have the shark on a dock being finned. So we did the light and dark side collection to raise awareness, and also as our project is still starting out, we're looking for donations. For us, it was a way to give an incentive and also to give something back to people who want to donate to our project.
Hmm. Yeah, it was really interesting. Yeah, it really caught my attention there. Okay. I have one more question left in this segment here, and this is back to you, I suppose. I mean, again, I've referenced this already, but when we were lining up this talk, I sense a certain enthusiasm that you had right away. Like I could pick up on that passion, even in an email that you have for the work that you do. And I'd like to know, like, what drives all of this? Again, you've kind of spoke to this in the beginning, I mean, your passions and whatnot, but what sustains it, I suppose, for you? Is it the impact that you can see that you're making, or, maybe you could share a little bit more on that?
You know, one time someone asked me, and he was like, would you rather? And then he's like, would you rather like you have one wish and then all the sharks in the world are protected and like they will never be finned again, nothing happens to them.
Yeah.
But then if your wish comes true, you can never go into the ocean again. Like you can never scuba dive, never free dive
These
again. It's
impossible
like, what would
questions.
you
Yeah.
do? And then I was like, of course I want the sharks to be protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've always really, really loved animals. And if I look at sharks, they're just so graceful and fascinating to me. Like I find them really beautiful. And the ocean is, I never understood why we put so much money into space exploration when
Yeah.
we have an alien world that we barely explored right on this planet. So I think from the exploration part, it's the beauty. And yeah, I love diving in the ocean when it's completely silent. To me, it's like meditation. I love
Mm,
all of that, even if that, I mean, I have no genie that can fulfill my wish, but even if that ever would just become a distant memory and I cannot go back, I just see so much beauty in it and just like an intrinsic right to exist, coexist
yeah.
with us.
Yeah. It kind of brings to mind, I recall James Cameron, the producer and director of Titanic, wildly famous film, of course. And years after he'd produced that, he'd set up a team to go back down, deep dive, like with this remote submarine to go down. And he was speaking about this. And one of his fascinations outside of just the Titanic itself was what you were just speaking of. Like, this is an alien world down there. And it really, I think it led him on to other projects to just explore just the wildlife, like these deep sea creatures, because it is so foreign, it is so exotic that, yeah, I can totally see how that would be, would suck you into that world. It would, fascinate you to no end, or anyone who's involved with it. So yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that. Okay.
And for me, it's also like, for example, last weekend, like it was like I was not having a good day. I wasn't feeling well, and I was like, I decided to go snorkeling, and I was just floating in the water. And on a different part of the reef we usually go onto where like I hadn't been, and then I saw for the first time ever in my life two African pompanos hunting, and I've never seen them before. I've never seen them in Okinawa. I didn't even know they're there. And then for me, that like made my day. I was like, oh, did you see the African pompanos? They're a trevally that has this like long threads at the end of their fins. They look, and they're very silvery and shiny. So they were really like beautiful to look at. And then I'm so excited. I don't know, some people collect Pokemon, and it was like I saw the African pompano. So there's always something new. Like it never disappoints me.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can definitely, I can understand that. I don't have those shared experiences, but I can understand with what you're saying, and I can appreciate all of that. So, okay. Well, we do have this middle segment here, and you just shared a story. So I don't know if you want to use that, but it is a water cooler story segment. And I don't know if you have something else that you'd like to share with listeners relating to your work, or we do we want to count that last story as the
Let's see, another story I can share. Oh, so when I first started my research, um, young and dashing PhD student, of course, I was like, I want to change the world and like end all the fisheries, like which I know now is, of course, it's not possible. But to me, fishermen were the enemy. And I lived in a fishing village in northern Japan.
wow.
And of course, I was working with them every every single day, and I started to, and some of them are very old. This old Japanese fishermen, they're over 80, and they're like, oh, they're like fossils and fishermen. They just like, you learn how much tradition and everything there is behind it all. And I remember what was really interesting to me, I think, is they didn't like me in the beginning. They were like, what is this foreigner doing here? And then
The
she's a
outsider,
woman on
yeah.
top. And then she came here to tell us what to do. Like, we've done this for decades. And then I think as I work with them, like every day, and they get used to me, like seeing me in the village, seeing me on the dock. On the morning, like every morning we became closer to each other. And like I remember in the beginning, like one of them, this really, really old guy, we had some discussion about shark finning, and I was like, you shouldn't fin the sharks because it's not sustainable. You should use the whole fish. And then like he's fighting, and he's like, oh, why don't you why did you go back to Germany and tell like German fishermen I can't fin the sharks? And then when I finished my research, I came back, and I hadn't been back for a while because I was in Tokyo and writing the thesis. And when I came back, I like came to the office, and he was like, "You're back, and you weren't here for months, and you didn't tell me. Like, where were you?" So I was like, "Oh, okay. Now you missed me." And I was like, very interesting how over like the course of a few years we actually became friends, and our discussions changed. And in the end, we actually talked about like how can we make fisheries more sustainable. And I saw them agreeing with a lot of these things I thought I would propose, they were proposing themselves. When they're saying that we should have size limits, we should have catch limits, we shouldn't fish sharks in areas where we know there's a lot of females when in the season they're pregnant. So everything's very natural. Like I learned they're really not the enemy at all. And then at the end of us all, as I presented my research and my thesis, he congratulated me, and then he gave me a gift from like many, many decades ago when he went on a fishing trip. He gave me a swordfish sword, and then I was like, okay, thank you. So like it's still in my house, and people are like, what's this? I'm like, it's a swordfish sword. An old fisherman gave it to me, so now it's like one of my proudest possessions, because it's like over years from like really not liking them or seeing them as the enemy, like now I see them as and as a stakeholder we need to connect with.
Yeah, yeah. It must have been such a valuable lesson outside of all the sentiment attached to it, is, a solid reminder for you moving forward. When you're speaking with people and you're meeting for the first time, it's putting that time in and really getting to know them and their issues, I suppose, and, not putting the walls up right away and,
Yeah,
allowing the relationship to build so you can have these breakthroughs, down the line, perhaps. So,
yeah.
yeah. Okay. No, thanks for sharing that. All right. Well, I do want to shift into our last segment here, actually, and it's something called the crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And in terms of things moving forward, from an ecological perspective, like we all know, we have issues, the climate crisis, the Great Barrier Reef was just in the news recently, I think, just today. I think Australia was trying to say that, yeah, no, it's not that bad. It's really not that bad. But some experts are saying, no, it is not in the best shape. We need to take some action here. And then, of course, you have the decimation of fish stocks all around the world. So, there's a lot of reason to have some pessimism moving forward, but also at the same time, there are reasons for optimism. And I would like to know a little bit more about Japan per se on that front. Like, how optimistic are you of the stakeholders within Japan, whether that be policymakers, whether it be, these fishery collectives, some of the people that you're working with, in terms of them coming around and, putting policies or creating plans, agendas that can actually have impact and have a positive benefit in terms of sustaining, the ecological preserves within the waters of Japan.
I've been in many different places in Japan and I've seen both good and bad.
Yeah.
So I can't like really say for like all of Japan. Like the port that I worked with from our PhD research in northern Japan is like this port alone actually makes up 80% of the shark fisheries in Japan. And they massively changed their regulations after. They put in
Mm,
catch limits, size limits. There were certain species that cannot be caught anymore. So that was a really, really big win. And then in other places, we still have things like targeted shark hunts. So targeted shark hunts because they think tiger sharks are dangerous. Tiger
mm,
sharks eat the fish they want to fish, so they don't kill. So they go out once or twice a year to kill the sharks on purpose. They're not consumed. They're just like killed as trophies.
yeah.
And those are things I wish that would end. And so in one place I've seen great things happen, and in another place I haven't yet. And I think it can still happen, but as you might also know, as someone else who lives in Japan, things happen here very, very slowly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I haven't given up hope, but I sometimes do wish things would move faster.
Mm, All right. Well, let's hope. Let's hope. And again, yeah, I'm conscious of your time, and I've really enjoyed this conversation from start to finish. I can't believe we're already drawing to a close here. I've probably got about 25 more questions I could ask you, but again, I'm conscious of your time, and I thank you immensely for coming on today and sharing all your insights.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Like as you can tell, I love talking about sharks, and I like always love every opportunity I have to like, tell people a little bit more about the ocean. Because as you know, we only protect what we love. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Well, for those interested in learning more about Mareike and her work, you can check her out, her company, Ocean Eye. You can also find her on LinkedIn and also on Instagram. And for reference, I will have links to the companies and her social sites as well. And also, too, if you like today's show, please be sure to share. I mean, these issues that we're speaking of today, they deserve to be put out there, and more people hearing them, the greater the chance of impact being made and agendas being pushed forward. Also, too, you can head on over to YouTube. I did launch a channel over there in the last year. And the cool thing is we'll have an image overlay off the top where you'll be able to see some imagery associated with the talk. So you can kind of take it in a different manner. And if you do, please hit subscribe. As you'll know right away, the channel could use a bit of love there. And then finally, don't forget to tune into the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.